Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I mixed that up, but that's all right. Um, Last week we finished up chapter 13 of the book of Genesis, right? We kind of looked at this idea where God reiterates his promises to Abraham. He's going to do this a few more times. We talked about, right, humans can be forgetful, we're fickle, and a lot of times we need a promise, a renewal of that promise. And we looked at how the promise is unconditional, right? It doesn't matter what Abraham does. He's Abram at this point still, but what Abram does, God has said, listen, it is through you that the Messiah is going to come. Now, it's going to be thousands of years before Jesus would come, right? But it's through his line that Messiah would come, and that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars in the sky, the sands on the shore, on the of the beach and stuff. And we know for because we can look back that it's going to actually that promise, part of the promise, is actually fulfilled through both the lines of Ishmael, which is where many of our Islamic and Muslim people today come from, and through the line of Isaac, which is where we get the Jewish people from. Um, and so we know that Abram takes his promises literal, even though he will never actually own the land that God promises him that he would have. And that's where we left it off. Now, before we actually jump into chapter 14 itself, I want to talk a little bit about the world of Abram. And what it looks like. Remember that this is like 6,000 or so years ago. Um, and so, yeah, 4,000 maybe, right? We're not exactly sure. So it looks vastly different than we have it today. So, um, roughly 100 years ago, we're talking about our time now, and that's actually more like 150 years ago now at this point, because one of the commentaries that I'm using is was written in like the 1960s, and so um, it's more like 150 or so years ago now. But either way, the existence of Abram was highly disputed. Most people likening him to somebody like Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, right? Romulus and Remus were two orphans who were raised by a she-wolf, and then they created this city and they fought, and Romulus won, which is why it's called Rome, and they were demigods and this, that, and the other thing. A lot of people went, well, it's the same basic idea, just in a different part of the world, a different story, but that Abraham is a myth, right? That's what a lot of people believed, unbelievers believed up until roughly 100, 150 years ago. But over the past 100 to 150 years before that of archaeology, we see that that's an outdated and ignorant view. We have discovered by excavations of the cities mentioned show that this is not a primitive sort of people, but highly advanced civilizations, just as Genesis depicts. Now, I'm not talking about they had computers and stuff like that, but not cavemen living in shelters and stuff like that. For instance, we know that the city of Ur, Abram's boyhood home, is now known to have been a great and prosperous city at the time that Abraham would have lived. We know that the Euphrates River had numerous different canals, and the city had a huge Babylonian ziggurat, a wealth of jewelry and art, and a vast library. These are not just nomadic peoples. These are not just people who have bounded together to form a small sort of settlement where you could keep maybe a little bit of crops and some sheep and stuff like that. These are vast, prosperous cities, just like the Bible indicates to us that they are. We also know that Egypt was already a great empire by this time, and had been for quite a long time. So, this idea that I know a lot of people, one of the things that people talk about is that the Bible couldn't be right because people couldn't write. They didn't have these sophisticated systems of math and record keeping and stuff like that. And it has been proven that that's just completely and utterly false. It's completely and utterly false. And to try to hold on to that view as we sit here in the year 2025 is to hold on to an ignorant view because you refuse to accept facts and archaeology that support the Bible strictly because you don't want to support the Bible. So we know that that cities existed in the way that the Bible depicts them. And though the exact timeline is uncertain, the most conservative scholars put Abraham no later than the 12th dynasty in Egypt. For perspective, the pyramids were built in the 4th dynasty, so it is likely They've already been standing for quite a long time by the time Abraham visits there. So you would have seen the pyramids and such like that. We have this view of history that it takes place over hundreds of thousands of years. It doesn't. It's far more condensed than that. Um, and we know while we cannot say like, okay, we have found, here it is, here's a secular thing that says that Abraham existed. The Bible has been proven right archaeologically and historically. Even if you want to put aside its theological things, the Bible has been proven right archaeologically, historically, as a accurate history time and time and time and time again. Um, and so we find that here. And so if you're going to hold on to the idea that it couldn't have possibly happened because cities weren't like that, people weren't like that, you are in an outdated viewpoint of what actually happens. And so we need to know that because it colors the way we view Abraham and his family and everything that's going on. These are not nomadic peoples. I mean, Abraham was. He never really, to our knowledge, didn't settle down in a city, right? He was more nomadic. But there were these great cities already in existence at this time. Now then, let's jump into chapter 14 now of Genesis. Genesis chapter 14. I'm going to start in verse 1. And there's a bunch of names in here. So forgive me if I don't pronounce them correctly. I will again reiterate, I'm not an expert in ancient Aramaic and Hebrew and stuff like that. So bear with me. I'm going to do my best. And if you are an expert in ancient language and you're like, well, he said that name wrong, I apologize. I do my best. So let's read it. Genesis chapter 14. I'm going to start in verse 1. And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Guam, that they made, or Goim, I should say, probably, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemaber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Canarium, and the Zuzim in Ham, and the Enim in Shevek Haramatha, and Horites in their Mount Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, excuse me, and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Belel, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Bunch of names there. The important thing to note is that all these cities bounded together against some other cities. We're going to talk about it. So Abram apparently lived in peace and quiet and security for several years until that peace was broken by a confederation of kings, right? Most scholars believe there is a slight time jump. We're not talking 30 years here, but a time jump between the end of chapter 23 and the beginning of chapter 14. And this peace that he's been living in is broken by this confederation of kings. And Abram, instead of running, stood firm on the promises of God and passed the test. Remember last time that he and his family faced hardship, they fled to Egypt, though they shouldn't have. This time, Abram has learned a lesson. He will stand firm. He will stand firm. And the confederacy was made up of 4 different kings. And they're kings of Shinar, or Babylonia, Elasar, which is a tribe in southern Babylonia, Elam, the original kingdom of Persia, and Goim, translated nations, but probably nations found in northeast Babylonia. At this point, the kingdoms were small, more like city-states, right? Not not controlling hundreds of thousands or thousands of miles, but they were city states that that would control their surrounding things, right? Think of ancient Greece and stuff like that. They would have this, right? Right. It wasn't until Alexander came and unified Greece that it had one ruler, right? Athens would have its ruler, and Sparta, and Corinth, etc., etc. It's the same idea here. It is possible that Amraphel was Hammurabi, right? Most people know about or you may have heard of the Code of Hammurabi. Um, but most think that Hammurabi actually comes years later than this. But it is technically possible. Names change over time. A lot of people, like, you take the name Jesus, for example. A lot of people like Jesus wasn't his real name. You are actually correct. It's Yeshua. Um, and then when it's changed into multiple different languages, into Koine Greek, and then so on and so forth, eventually we end up with Jesus. So names can change based on the language that you're speaking. Um, and so it's possible. Now, none of these other kings have been identified archaeologically yet, but like I said, the Bible has proven itself to be a true account. And so we're going to take it as fact that these kings existed and that they were ruling and that they decided to attack. The Salt Sea doesn't exist yet at this time, right? Um, and it is another addition by Moses to say that this takes place in the valley of the Salt Sea. Again, remember that Moses is the compiler of Genesis for us. And so he adds in, right? Last week, he added in the town of, or the city of Haran, right? He adds things in to give the people that he was with a good idea of where things are happening, right? It would be like if we said, oh, um, this happened in New Milford, which is where I'm at, right? This happened in New Milford, near the old Walmart. Well, first off, there's never been a Walmart here, but near where Rob's Market is now. Rob's Market didn't exist 100 years ago, right? It's to give context to the current day readers where things are. And this salt sea would later become known as the Dead Sea, right? And we know that it's a salty sea. You can go there now. The Dead Sea exists, and it's called the Dead Sea because very little can actually live in it because it is so salty, because it has tributaries into it, but no tributaries out of it. So what happens is, right, the water itself evaporates, leaving behind the minerals, the salt and the minerals and such. And so over the course of time, that water has just become saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier, et cetera, et cetera. And for 12 years, the cities in the plain, in the area, paid tribute. But in the 13th, they rebelled. They were done paying tribute. They were tired of it, and they didn't want to keep doing it. Makes sense, right? We see this happen in today's world and throughout history. The result of this rebellion, however, was a destructive invasion of the entire region. So in come these four kings. They go, oh, you want to rebel? Cool. We'll just destroy you. And the kings made one fatal decision, though, not the kings that rebelled. The four kings made one fatal decision. They took Lot, who, although he is living in Sodom, or right near Sodom, was a righteous man, according to 2 Peter 2:8. And he was the nephew of Abram. And God would not allow Lot to be carried off by Chedorlaomer. If they had left Abram and Lot alone, my guess is that this is a footnote in history, but they took Lot. And Abram was not going to stand by and allow this to happen. Let's see now what Abram decides to do, starting in verse 13. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So, a fugitive shows up to tell Abram the Hebrew. This is interesting. This is the first mention of the name Hebrew in the Bible. Now, we know that they will become known as the Hebrews eventually and stuff like that, right? There's even a book of the Bible called Hebrews, and it is a book written specifically to the Hebrew nation. But the origins of this word are actually uncertain. We don't know. Most think is derived from Eber, which is one of the distant ancestors. I believe it says either his grandfather or great grandfather of Abram, and it's derived from him. Remember that a lot of things happen when it comes to names, right? You get named things even today, right? A lot of people didn't have last names. You would be known as John the Smith. And eventually, over time, it just became John Smith, John the Carpenter. Now you've got John Carpenter, right? Stuff like that. People were named, even in other cultures, you would see, I think of like in Norse sorts of things, right? You will see Thor, Odin's son. He is Thor, Odin's son, right? Stuff like that. And so it's very possible that it comes from the name Eber. The term Habiru, that's Habiru, also appears, but it does not apply specifically to Israel. It was used to refer to any moving tribe, which was very true of the Israelites. Hebrew, as used here, has also been translated the man from beyond the river or the Euphrates. In any case, right, so these are all reasons that it could be used. In any case, its used here is distinguishes Abram from the other inhabitants, even though he had economic and political pacts with some of them. He has not become one of them, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Hittites, all of that. He is his own person. And this separates him from all of them. And Abram had very obviously a tribal, excuse me, Abram was very obviously a tribal chieftain, at the very least by this point. He had a massive tribe, right? He has 318 men, I believe it says, if memory serves correctly, that go to fight with him. There's probably at least there's at least that many women probably or near there, and then children and stuff like that. So he's probably in charge of 1,000 at least, if not more people by this point. And these people were from his own household. He was able to gather these 318 men. This does not mean his children, right? We know that Abram only has two children, Ishmael and Isaac, but his household means when in the Bible, when we see a household, it also includes servants and things like that. It's the whole group that he commands. He's able to get 318 trained men to go with him. And it was probable as well that some Amorites also went with him, so that this military is slightly larger, maybe 400 to 500 people. The odds were probably similar to Gideon's odds years later, right? Thousands of years later, or maybe not quite thousands, but 1,000 or so years later, Gideon faces off with a massive military, massive army with only a few men. And he actually employs a similar tactic to what Abram does here. The armies of the four kings were probably relaxing and drunk and asleep, and Abram attacks them from all sides, distracting, demoralizing, and confusing them. It's a good tactic and wins the day. Now, we're not going to continue on into verse 17 here today, but suffice it to say that Abram has won this great battle. Next week, we will deal with the question of, okay, Abram's won this battle. What is he going to do with the spoils of war? And we're going to see the heart of Abram and the character of Abram here next week as we continue on. As always, if you have questions, comments, put them down below. Like, share, and subscribe on whatever you may be watching, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. God bless. Have a great week, and I will see you all next week as we continue our study of Genesis.